Let me tell you something that almost no Western politician will say out loud. Not in an election year, not ever. The West cannot decouple from China. Not in 5 years, not in 10, maybe not even in 20. And the reason isn't what you think. It's not just about cheap labor. It's not about rare earths. It's about 3 deeply embedded systems that took 4 decades to build, and that no amount of tariffs, reshoring rhetoric, or friendshoring buzzwords can replace. So why does every headline keep telling you otherwise? Here's what the mainstream narrative gets wrong. They frame this as a choice, as if the United States, Europe, and their allies are sitting at a table with options laid out neatly in front of them. Option A, keep buying from China. Option B, bring it all home. Option C, move it to Vietnam or India. Sounds simple, sounds empowering, sounds like sovereignty, but it's a fantasy. And I'm going to show you exactly why, using real numbers, real examples, and 3 systems that most analysts either don't understand or deliberately ignore. I call this the triple lock. 3 forces that don't just make China a convenient supplier, they make China a structurally irreplaceable one. The 3 forces are industrial depth, process knowledge monopoly, and logistical synchronization. Each one alone would be a serious obstacle to decoupling. Together, they form something closer to a physical law than a policy problem. Let's start with the first force, industrial depth. Most people hear supply chain, and they picture a factory, maybe a warehouse, maybe a container ship. But China's industrial ecosystem isn't a supply chain. It's a supply civilization. When I visited Shenzhen's manufacturing district 2 years ago, I expected to see large factories pumping out electronics. What I actually saw was something far more significant. I saw an entire urban geography organized around production. Within a single square mile, there were component makers, mold designers, packaging suppliers, logistics brokers, quality testing labs, and raw material wholesalers, all within walking distance of each other, all operating in real time, all feeding into one another like organs in a body. This is what economists call industrial clustering, but that term doesn't capture the scale. Let me show you the numbers that matter. China has over 6.9 million manufacturing enterprises. Not factories. Enterprises. The United States has roughly 385,000. India has around 640,000 registered manufacturing units, many of which are micro-scale. Now here's the critical part. It's not the total number that matters, it's the density per product category. For electronics alone, the Pearl River Delta region hosts an estimated 47,000 component-level suppliers. That's not an economy, that's a living organism. Here's what nobody tells you. When Apple wanted to shift some iPhone production to India, they didn't struggle because Indian workers weren't skilled enough. They struggled because a single missing screw specification required a supplier that didn't exist within 1,000 miles. In Shenzhen, that supplier is across the street. In Chennai, it has to be built from scratch or imported. That's not a gap you close with subsidies. That's a gap that represents decades of compounding industrial evolution. And this is precisely why the numbers on reshoring look so discouraging when you dig beneath the surface. The Reshoring Initiative, a US-based organization that tracks manufacturing returns, reported that in 2022, roughly 364,000 jobs were announced for reshoring and foreign direct investment combined. That sounds impressive until you realize China's manufacturing sector employs approximately 112 million people. Let me say that again, 112 million. The entire US manufacturing workforce is 12.9 million. You're not closing that gap. You're not even denting it. A senior supply chain analyst at one of the Big Four consulting firms told me off the record that most Western reshoring announcements are, and I'm quoting here, press releases, not production lines. Companies announce plans. They accept government subsidies. They break ground. But the actual output rarely matches the rhetoric. Because building a factory is the easy part. Building the 10,000 micro-suppliers that feed that factory is the part no one wants to talk about. And that's just the first layer of the triple lock. The second force, process knowledge monopoly, is even more devastating to the decoupling argument. Because it's not about what China builds, it's about what China knows. And that distinction changes everything. Let me show you. So here's the second force at work. And this one operates on a level that most trade policy experts completely overlook. I call it the process knowledge monopoly. And if industrial depth is the body of China's manufacturing dominance, process knowledge is the brain. You can try to replicate the body. But replicating 4 decades of accumulated institutional intelligence? That's a different problem entirely. Let me explain what I mean. When we talk about manufacturing, we tend to focus on the end product, the smartphone, the solar panel, the electric vehicle battery. But the real competitive advantage isn't in the product, it's in the process of making the product. It's in knowing that a specific polymer needs to be heated to exactly 173 degrees Celsius for 42 seconds, not 40, not 45, to achieve the tensile strength required for a particular automotive gasket. That knowledge doesn't live in a textbook. It lives in the hands and minds of engineers and floor managers who've been refining that process for 15 or 20 years. Here's what makes people uncomfortable. This kind of knowledge isn't transferable through licensing agreements. It isn't captured in patents. And it definitely isn't something you can download. A former procurement director at a major German automaker told me something I've never forgotten. He said, "We can send the blueprints anywhere in the world, but the blueprints are maybe 30% of the product. The other 70% is in the process, and the process lives in China." Let me show you what this actually means with a real example. In 2021, the European Union launched a major initiative to build domestic solar panel manufacturing capacity. The goal was energy sovereignty, reduce dependence on Chinese panels, which at that point accounted for roughly 78.7% of global production. Billions in subsidies were announced, political speeches were made, timelines were set. Fast forward to late 2023, and Europe's share of global solar panel manufacturing had actually declined. Not increased. Declined. Why? Because even when European companies built the factories and purchased the equipment, they couldn't match the yield rates of Chinese manufacturers. Chinese solar cell producers were achieving conversion efficiency rates above 26.1% on mass production lines. European startups were stuck around 22 to 23%. That 3-point gap doesn't sound like much until you realize it translates into billions of dollars in cost difference at scale. And that gap exists because of process knowledge. The Chinese manufacturers had spent over a decade optimizing every single micro-step in the production chain. The silicon purification, the wafer slicing, the doping process, the anti-reflective coating application. Each of these steps had been refined through millions of iterations, not theoretically, practically. On the factory floor, day after day, year after year. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because this is the kind of analysis that takes weeks to research and most outlets simply won't do. Now let me connect this to something even bigger. The process knowledge monopoly doesn't just apply to solar panels. It applies to pharmaceuticals, it applies to electronics, it applies to the critical chemicals used in semiconductor fabrication. Here's a number that should stop you cold. China produces 93.7% of the world's supply of refined manganese, a material essential for EV batteries and steel production. But it's not just that they mine it. It's that they've perfected the electrolytic refining process to a level of purity that no other country can consistently match at scale. When Australia tried to develop domestic manganese refining capacity in 2022, their pilot facility produced material at roughly 88% purity. The Chinese standard is 99.7%. That's not a competitive gap. That's a generational gap. Most people think decoupling is about political will, but here's what's really happening. Decoupling is a knowledge problem disguised as a trade problem. And knowledge of this kind, tacit, experiential, deeply embedded in human capital and institutional memory, is the single hardest thing to replicate in any economy. You can build a factory in 18 months. You can train workers in 2 to 3 years. But recreating the process intelligence of an entire industrial ecosystem? That takes a generation. Minimum. When I was in Beijing last year, I sat down with a materials scientist who consults for 3 of China's largest battery manufacturers. I asked him directly, what would it take for the West to replicate what China has built? He didn't hesitate. He said, 20 years and the willingness to fail 10,000 times. The West wants results in quarters. We measured progress in decades. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The West didn't lose this race recently. It lost it slowly, quietly, Over 30 years of outsourcing not just labor, but learning. Every time a Western company moved production to China to save 11% on unit costs, they weren't just transferring jobs, they were transferring knowledge. And that knowledge compounded, year after year, factory after factory, until what China possessed wasn't just capacity, it was cognition. And that brings us to the third and final force in the triple lock, logistical synchronization. And this is the one that makes even the most optimistic reshoring advocate go quiet. Because it's not about what China makes or what China knows, it's about how China moves, and the speed at which it does it will fundamentally reshape your understanding of why decoupling is a fantasy dressed up as strategy. So let's talk about the third force. And honestly, this is the one that keeps supply chain executives awake at night. Logistical synchronization. Because you can have the factories, you can even have the knowledge, but if you can't move materials, components, and finished goods with surgical precision across thousands of nodes simultaneously, you don't have a supply chain. You have a warehouse with ambitions. Here's what most people don't realize about China's logistics infrastructure. It isn't just big, it's orchestrated. And the difference between big and orchestrated is the difference between having an army and having an army that can mobilize in 12 hours. Let me give you a number that puts this in perspective. China's high-speed rail network spans 42,000 kilometers. That's more than the rest of the world combined. But that's the passenger stat everyone knows. What they don't tell you is that China's freight rail network moves 4.9 billion metric tons of cargo annually. The entire European Union moves approximately 1.5 billion. The United States, roughly 1.7 billion. China isn't just ahead. It operates in a different category. But rail is only one layer. China has 7 of the world's 10 busiest container ports. Shanghai alone handled 49.5 million TEUs in 2023. To put that in context, the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach combined handled approximately 16.2 million. One Chinese city moves 3 times the container volume of America's 2 busiest ports, and it does it with average dwell times, that's how long a container sits before being moved, of under 48 hours. In many U.S. ports, that number exceeds 5 days. When I spoke to a logistics coordinator working out of Ningbo Zhoushan Port, she laughed when I asked about bottlenecks. She said, "Bottleneck is an American word. Here we call it a scheduling error and it gets fixed before lunch." Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything about how you see this picture. It's not just the physical infrastructure, it's the digital synchronization layer on top of it. China has built what is arguably the world's most integrated logistics technology stack. The National Transportation and Logistics Public Information Platform connects over 450,000 enterprises across shipping, rail, trucking, and warehousing. In real time. This means that when a factory in Guangzhou finishes a production run at 3 a.m., a truck is already waiting at the loading dock because the system predicted the completion time based on machine output data fed into the platform 6 hours earlier. The container slot at Nansha Port is already reserved. The customs paperwork is pre-cleared digitally. The vessel berth is assigned. Let me show you what this actually means for Western companies trying to compete. When Walmart, Target, or any major Western retailer places an order from a Chinese supplier, the entire fulfillment cycle from order confirmation to port departure averages 8.6 days. When similar orders are placed with manufacturers in Vietnam or India, that cycle stretches to 21 to 35 days. And that's in optimal conditions. During monsoon season in South Asia or during infrastructure disruptions, which happen frequently, those timelines can double. Here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in Washington or Brussels wants to acknowledge publicly. Reshoring and friendshoring don't just cost more in labor and materials, they cost more in time. And in modern retail and manufacturing, time is the most expensive input of all. Every additional day a product spends in transit is a day of inventory carrying cost. It's a day of capital tied up. It's a day of demand forecasting error compounding. A senior economist at the World Bank told me off the record that the hidden cost of supply chain delay adds between 7.3 and 11.8% to total product cost for consumer goods. That's not a rounding error. That's a margin killer. And this is where the 3 forces converge into something that I think most analysts fundamentally misunderstand. Industrial depth means China can build anything. Process knowledge means China can build it better. Logistical synchronization means China can deliver it faster. These three systems don't operate independently. They feed each other. The density of suppliers reduces lead times. The process knowledge reduces defect rates, which reduces returns and reshipping. The logistics infrastructure means that even micro-corrections in orders can be fulfilled in days, not weeks. I want you to think about that for a moment. This isn't a supply chain advantage. This is a civilizational infrastructure advantage, and it was built deliberately, over decades, with state coordination, private sector execution, and a level of strategic patience that Western democracies structurally struggle to replicate. So, where does this leave us? What does the triple lock actually mean for the future of global trade, Western industrial policy, and the power balance between East and West? Because the implications aren't just economic, they're strategic, they're political, and frankly, they're existential for certain industries. Let me pull this all together. Let me pull this together because when you see the triple lock as a unified system rather than three separate advantages, the picture that emerges is fundamentally different from what you're hearing on the news. Industrial depth. Process knowledge monopoly, logistical synchronization. These aren't just competitive edges. Together, they form what I call the structural dependency architecture. And that architecture isn't a bug in the global system. It is the system. Here's what I mean. Over the past 40 years, the global economy wasn't just globalized. It was synchronized around a single node. China didn't just join the world's supply chains. It became the supply chain. Every other country, including the United States, Germany, Japan, and South Korea, organized its production logic around the assumption that China would always be there to provide the middle layer. The components, the sub-assemblies, the processed materials, the stuff between raw earth and finished product. That middle layer is where all three forces of the triple lock operate simultaneously. And it's the hardest layer to replace because it's the least visible and the most complex. When people talk about decoupling, they imagine snapping one cord and plugging it in somewhere else. But here's what's really happening. The cord isn't a cord, it's a root system. And it's grown into the foundation of virtually every major industry on Earth. Automotive, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, telecommunications, energy, agriculture technology, medical devices. Pick any sector and trace it back 3 or 4 tiers, and you'll find China. Not as a supplier of convenience, but as the supplier of necessity. A question I get asked constantly is, what about Vietnam? What about India? What about Mexico? And look, these are legitimate alternatives for certain product categories. Vietnam's electronics exports grew by 11.4% in 2023. India's manufacturing GDP expanded at 7.1%. Mexico is booming with nearshoring investment. I don't deny any of that. But here's the paradox nobody wants to name. Most of that growth is still dependent on Chinese inputs. Vietnam imports 37.8% of its manufacturing components from China. India imports critical pharmaceutical intermediaries, roughly 67% of its API supply, from Chinese chemical producers. Mexico's fastest-growing export sectors rely on Chinese machinery and Chinese subcomponents. So when Western leaders celebrate friendshoring, what they're often really celebrating is adding one extra step between themselves and China. The dependency hasn't decreased. It's just been laundered through a third country. If you want to understand the future of this dynamic, just look at 3 scenarios that are now playing out simultaneously. Scenario 1 is what I call managed dependency. This is the most likely path for the next decade. Western nations continue to publicly push decoupling rhetoric while privately deepening procurement relationships with Chinese suppliers through intermediary countries. Trade data gets reclassified. Political optics are maintained. But the structural reality doesn't change. This is already happening. U.S. imports labeled as originating from Vietnam and Malaysia have surged since 2019. But investigative audits have revealed that between 22 and 31% of that volume contains majority Chinese content. The labels change. The dependency doesn't. Scenario 2 is selective sovereignty. In this path, Western nations identify a narrow band of truly critical sectors, semiconductors, rare earths, advanced pharmaceuticals, and invest massively in domestic capacity for those alone. Everything else stays tied to China. This is the more honest version of industrial policy, and it's roughly what the CHIPS Act in the United States and the European CHIPS Act are attempting. But even here, the numbers are sobering. The CHIPS Act allocated $52.7 billion for semiconductor manufacturing. TSMC's single fab in Arizona is projected to cost over $40 billion. Intel's Ohio expansion is budgeted at $20 billion. You can see the math. The money runs out before the problem does. Scenario 3 is the one that almost nobody discusses publicly, but that several analysts I've spoken with consider increasingly plausible. Strategic acceptance. In this scenario, Western governments quietly acknowledge that full decoupling is neither possible nor desirable. Instead, they negotiate frameworks for managed interdependence, accepting Chinese supply chain centrality while building redundancy buffers for emergency scenarios. This is essentially what Japan has been doing since 2020, creating a dual-track system that maintains Chinese trade flows while subsidizing backup capacity domestically. So here's the final uncomfortable truth. The West's dependence on Chinese supply chains isn't a failure of policy. It's the result of policy. Decades of deliberate offshoring, cost optimization, and shareholder-driven decision-making built this architecture intentionally, and unwinding it would require the same level of strategic patience and coordinated investment that built it. Except in reverse. Against market incentives, with higher costs, and with no guarantee of success. The structural dependency architecture isn't a trap China set. It's a house the West built and then handed China the keys to. Understanding that distinction is the first step toward navigating what comes next. If this analysis changed how you think about global supply chains, subscribe and turn on notifications because I go deeper on these dynamics every week. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Do you think the West can realistically reduce its dependence on China within the next decade, or is the triple lock permanent? I read every comment, and some of the best insights I've gotten for future videos have come directly from this community. I'll see you in the next one.